Well, good day and welcome to Lesson 48 in our study of the book of Mark. We're still in chapter 11 and today from verses 12 down to 22. Jesus had come into Bethany the night before. He made his way up to Bethany from Jericho, and after he arrived in Bethany, he went into the temple and looked around, but nothing was said. He did nothing. He apparently met no one. He just looked around, perhaps reminiscing about previous times in the temple. But then after that, he went back to Bethany. And as we pick up the story in the next verse of chapter 11, it says, the next day, the following day, when they had come out from Bethany back into Jerusalem, Jesus was hungry. And he, seeing afar a fig tree having leaves, he went to see if perhaps he would find something on it. When he came to it, he found nothing on it but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. His response, Jesus said to it, "Let no one eat fruit from you ever again." When I read this a number of times before, it was always difficult to understand why this passage seemed to be so. This is a sort of a prophecy, a prediction, and it was one of negativity. Most of the predictions and most of the prophecies Jesus gave were positive. This was a negativity, and I often wonder why Jesus cursed the fig tree. What had this poor tree done? It just hadn't shown any fruit for that particular time. And it was really, this was in the spring of the year, it was really early in the day, in the time for figs to be on trees anyway, although some types of figs apparently do show fruit early in the year. The fig tree also, the fruit of the fig tree also seems to appear in some form before the leaves. So Jesus, having seen leaves, would have expected some kind of fruit to be on this tree, something that he could eat on the way into Jerusalem. But Jesus cursed this fig tree. And it was very difficult really to understand why. And if you're just reading the Bible, it really gives no real explanation for it. Although in the next passage, it says Jesus went into the temple. And they came to Jerusalem, and Jesus went into the temple and began to drive out those who bought and sold in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry wares through the temple. Then he taught, saying to them, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of thieves." These are words from Isaiah when he said this, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of thieves." Also from Jeremiah. So we go from the fig tree to this cleansing of the temple in Jerusalem. Now this in itself is a miracle. Jesus is one person. The temple would have been crowded, it would have been really seeming with people, because this was Passover, and there were perhaps hundreds of thousands of people in the temple area. It has been recorded at one Passover that the temple, there was a sacrifice of over 250,000 lambs in order to satisfy the needs of the people. And since apparently one lamb could be sacrificed for every 10 people, that meant there may have been somewhere in the vicinity of 2.5 million people in Jerusalem at that time. So this was a very crowded, busy place. And Jesus went and did all this by himself, no one stopping him at the time, because he had the authority, and people knew he had authority to do what he was doing. So how does this relate to the fig tree? There are a number of explanations given for this, but one of the explanations is that the figs have always been associated with Israel and the Jewish people. And there are a number of passages, one being in Matthew, where it said, Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? They're talking about the fruit of a tree and the same way that men bear fruit. So you're getting back now into the temple. And it's interesting that the temple that was built at the time of Christ was actually the third Jewish temple. The first was built by Solomon, and it was a beautiful and magnificent structure, but it was apparently defiled at the end because of idols which Solomon and his wives took into the temple. The second temple was built sometime after this, and it was not quite as elaborate, but it was also defiled by a king called Antiochus, who was a Gentile and who defiled the temple by raising a statue of Zeus in the temple and by sacrificing pigs on the altar. And this whole situation was part of the reason of the Maccabean revolt back a few hundred years before Christ. The third temple was built by Herod, and it was also a magnificent structure. And this is the temple that Jesus is now talking about. He is now in, and he is now causing the upset. And why? Because, as he said, the temple was to be the house of God, a house of prayer, and a house of prayer for all nations. But the people in authority had made it a den of thieves. And it had made it that way because of the way in which they had done and which they conducted business there. For instance, there were some people who had the authority to determine what was a proper sacrifice. And their idea was they often did not allow the people to bring their own doves or sheep or lambs in because they always found something wrong with them, and therefore those same people had to buy from those merchants in the temple at exorbitant prices. They were not allowed to take Roman coins into the temple. They were not allowed to take coins bearing the images of false gods or of foreign gods into the temple. Therefore, all those coins had to be exchanged for Hebrew shekels. And again, there was an exorbitant exchange rate being charged. So these merchants and these people in the temple were really gouging the populace in an effort to make money for themselves and in an effort to keep power under their own control. And this is what Jesus was rebelling about. He didn't allow anyone to carry wares through the temple. And he taught, saying to them, "Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves." And just as the temple was rotten and not bearing fruit, even though on the outside it was gilded, it had all sorts of outward appearance of wealth and power and religion. Inside, it was dead and decayed and rotten. And this is often what Jesus called the scribes and the Pharisees. He said, "You are hypocritical. You hypocrites. You vipers." Because on the outward they kept the commandments, but inwardly they did not keep the spirit of what the commandments taught. So this is the idea of the fig tree. The fig tree had leaves, beautiful leaves, suggesting that there should be fruit on the tree. But there was no fruit. It had leaves, but no fruit. It had the outward appearance of healthiness, of sustenance, but there was nothing there in reality. The temple had an outward appearance of prosperity and of religion, but inward it was dead, it was full of hypocrites. So the scribes and the chief priests, when they heard it, then they really became enamored to get rid of him, to destroy him. It says, They sought how they might destroy him, for they feared him. Now they were afraid of Jesus because he had such a following. They were afraid of him because of the potential loss of their power, of their prestige, of their position, of their influence, and of their wealth. Jesus threatened all of this because he was showing the hypocrisy of what they were saying, what they were teaching, versus how they were living. They feared him. They feared him, and they feared the people who were following him. All the people, it says, were astonished at his teaching. The people themselves at that time were very much enamored with Jesus. And the scribes and the Pharisees and the leaders were afraid to do anything because of his popularity with the populace. Now, when the evening had come, after all this had done, after he had done all these things in the temple, when evening hit, he went out of the city again. He left the city again. So Jesus cursed the fig tree. This was an analogy of what was going on in the temple and in the country of Judea as a whole, where there were many examples of outward appearance of worship, of dedication, of holiness, but inwardly these were not the same. Inwardly things were rotten and not doing well at all. So Jesus showed this in the fig tree as an analogy. Just as a fig tree showed leaves of promise, there was no fruit. There was nothing coming from it. And the next day, when they passed by, they saw the fig tree dried up from the roots. And Peter, remembering, said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree which you cursed has withered away. This was a prophecy. This was an analogy. This was a prophecy as to what would happen to the temple. What would happen to the religion of the people who followed the Jewish religion and customs and the commandments to the letter rather than to the spirit. And it was only a few decades after this that the Roman temple was the Hebrew temple, was completely destroyed by Roman armies, without one stone being left unturned. So this parable about the fig tree really relates, as far as I can tell, to the temple and to the various ways in which the temple had been built up, then had become corrupt, hypocritical, evil from within, and then destroyed because of this evilness and this lack of faith and lack of trueness. The fig tree was the same way. It had leaves, it showed like it was healthy, it showed like it was doing good, it showed like it was in great shape, but there were no figs. This also applies today to us, to churches, to bodies that on the outward appear very healthy, very sincere, very true, but inward, are they as true as they appear? Or are they as corrupt and as evil as the temple was in the day of Christ? These are the things that you have to consider when we're doing these studies and doing these readings. So this is really the story of the fig tree and the temple. And we'll get on to the next part of chapter 11 next week. Thanks again for watching, and bye for now.